Which is proof and paintings. Well, welcome everybody. Slightly more here than I was expecting, so thank you all for your attendance. That's fantastic. Especially to Alison's guests, non-members of the Trades House. Is this the first time you guys have been here?
It is for me, yeah.
Let's hope it's not the last. Nurture them, Alison. So just a wee bit of background as to why we're all here. As part of the Charities Committee, which I should explain who that consists of at the moment. So there's myself, there's Barbara in the green, and there's, where's Brian? Brian's there. Plus Norman, who's not with us. We've also got Alistair Dorwood, who's just had to leave. We've got Duncan on the screen, Duncan Big Project, and Alistair Kinship Care. We have assorted members of the platform, and we have John, Katrina and Lorraine, essential members of our committee who we couldn't do without. So basically the Charities Committee is responsible for the funds that have been gifted to Trades House rather than individual crafts. We award about £450,000 per annum from the investments that are held on behalf of the House. There are some quite specific restrictions on some of them, but most of them are quite broad, and we can really just address, we tend to address poverty, education, children, families, and that tends to be the kind of broad remit, the most vulnerable, certainly in our city. We had a brainstorming session last year with assorted members of the platform and the Charities Committee, and we asked ourselves some questions. Who should we be giving to? How should we be funding it? And what do we need to do to achieve these goals? So lots of good ideas come out of that, and we're actually going to revisit them at our next meeting to see how far we've progressed with these. But one of the recommendations was to invite external speakers so that we would become more educated to the city or to poverty or whatever. So hence Chris Birt from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who had intended to be here in person, but due to unforeseen circumstances is stuck in Edinburgh. So welcome, Chris. Just before I let you loose, Chris is a lawyer who was with the First Minister's Policy and Delivery Unit before joining the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And he was one of the authors that has recently published a paper painting an incredibly bleak picture of Scotland's poverty. It would be good to make this session as interactive as possible. Now, there's a lot of us in the room and there's quite a few people on the screen. I'll do my best to look out if somebody wants to make a point or ask a question. But if you could raise your hand, then we'll have half a chance of being able to hear the question. So, Chris, can I hand over to you? I think you're going to speak for about 25 minutes or so, and then perhaps if nobody's asked a question by that time or got involved, you'll be made to. Okay. So, Chris, could you kick off?
Of course. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. Okay. Well, firstly, thanks, Laura, and thanks for allowing me to join you online. I'm sorry not to be joining you in person, but a multitude of layered on top of one another family crises have kept me in Edinburgh, so I'm sorry not to be with you. But also I've been sat on the call for the last few minutes and heard lots of your cheery chat over the line, and unfortunately though I'm not often the most cheery speaker on these subjects because these are very difficult times, and as Laura said, we described in our annual kind of State of the Nation report, Poverty in Scotland last year, as the country facing a bleak time, and I think that is true. So I will hopefully be interesting, but I can't promise necessarily to be cheerful. So while I'm talking today, and if folk have questions as I go along, do just wave your hand, as Laura said. But what I'd like to try and cover is sort of some of the headlines of where we are just now. To address briefly the cost of living crisis which country faces at the moment. Also to get into some of the things that Laura's mentioned around who is most at risk of poverty, as well as what are the causes of poverty in Scotland and what we should do, both as a country, what you guys could do as an organisation, your individual businesses within your own communities, etc. So that's hopefully what I'll set out in the next 25 minutes or so. Time for questions at the end, but if you have any questions as we go, wave your hand. As Laura said, I thought I'd just start quickly with a brief history of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, because as the name suggests, it comes from the Rowntree family, who's, as you probably know, are based mainly in York and surrounds and were chocolate producers and fruit pastels, etc. But they were part of the so-called liberal reform movement at the kind of turn of the 19th and 20th century. And one of those things, so what Joseph Rowntree did is he left various endowments, which we benefit from today, but he also kind of walked the walk. So his factories in York were one of the first places to introduce 5-day working weeks, closed hours, and he also built in New Yearswick in York a housing development of essentially what we would consider to be social housing for the workers in the factories in and around York. And he thought that people should have outside spaces in their housing as well. And that's why if you look at Rowntree's confectionery these days, you would see 2 fruit trees in the badge on the sweets or whatever. And that's what they built in each of the houses. There was a small allotment and 2 fruit trees in the front garden. So that's where that comes from. So not only did the Rowntree family do research and advocate on behalf of people in poverty, but they also did try and bring that into reality as well. And I think that, particularly from your own perspective, I think that's something worth reflecting on. But where are we in Scotland at the moment? We are not in a great place, to be honest. Over 1 million people in Scotland live in what's called relative poverty, which is, it's not a perfect measure by any stretch of imagination, but it's kind of an internationally accepted one. It's that people are living off of less than 60% of the average household income. So about 1 million people in Scotland live below that level just now. The biggest group amongst those are children, where about 250,000 children live in poverty. This has been the case for quite some time, to be honest. The story since the turn of the millennium had been a small drop in overall poverty levels, but that was particularly amongst pensioners, largely down to state pension reform, and amongst children, with introduction of things like child tax credits in the early 2000s. But that has been, to a large extent, reversed since the financial crash, as austerity has kicked into the social security system. And I think there's one thing, we're about to publish something in the next few weeks, which I think is actually should give lots of people pause, because it shows that very deep poverty in Scotland, and there's a similar pattern across the UK, has increased across all of that time. So whether there's been a Labour government at Westminster, a Conservative government at Westminster, whichever government in the Scottish Parliament, the number of people living in extremely low incomes has risen significantly. And actually the group of people living in poverty now live in deeper poverty than they did at the turn of the millennium. And part of that is driven by policy choices. In particular, single people and people with disabilities have been forced to get by on extremely low incomes. And I think that's also worth reflecting on today. Like, the Trussell Trust are an organisation who, as you probably know, provide food bank services across the UK, including in Glasgow. The number of food packages they've given in Glasgow has doubled in the last 10 years. They also, and you can speak to some of the volunteers who work with them, who they went to start work in a food bank as a volunteer in 2012 or something, thought they'd be there for a month. Thought, oh, this is a bad period. We'll be here for a short time. And here we are 10 years later, where the Trussell Trust hand out over 2 million food packages every year. Food banks shouldn't exist in a country as wealthy as the UK or as Scotland. It's now an industry, it's a sector. Most people didn't know what they were quite recently. And this last winter, we've had people talking about things like warm banks. I mean, warm banks used to be known as indoors. The fact that we have even the conception of something like warm banks is shocking, really. And I think that this recent cost of living crisis, while obviously the peak in inflation has to some extent been out with most people's control, what the cost of living crisis has done is feasted on those structural weaknesses that we have in the economy, that so many people try to survive on extremely low incomes, and so that they are very sensitive to changes in prices. So we're sensitive to small changes in prices, but we see food inflation, it's 15, 16%. And for families on low incomes, they don't spend money on non-essential items. So if those essential items get more expensive, then we see debt, we see homelessness, etc., etc. And we looked in our report at the end of last year about what some of those impacts have been. And again, it's these kind of structural weaknesses. So about a third of all people in Scotland, that's not just those in low incomes, a third of all people either have no savings or have savings under £250. About 2/3 of people were unemployed, whereas it's double that rate for people who are unemployed. And 70%, 7 in 10 single parents have no savings beyond £250, and most of them have none. So again, it shows you just how fragile a position so many households are in. And there's been a kind of trope going about over the last couple of years of people having to choose between heating and eating. That's not the case for many. About 1 in 5 low-income families have at some stage in the last year neither heated their home properly nor had enough food to eat. So it's not a choice. People are going without both warmth and not being hungry. Connected to some of those issues around savings, again, 1 in 10 families wouldn't be able to pay an unexpected bill of £200. And frankly, at the moment, most people's energy bills will be an unexpected bill of £200, even for relatively modest homes. So again, that's why I describe the cost of living crisis really feasting on structural weaknesses that we have within our economy. And then that's the kind of the financial impacts, and we see how that goes into families having to make horrible decisions about not eating or not heating. I mean, we've even had one woman tell us that she was delaying weaning her baby because she didn't know how she'd be able to afford food for them. And that obviously will sort of not have the knock-on effects on both the physical and mental health of people. So again, when we did a survey of people, 3 in 4 families with a child where someone has a disability have suffered mental ill health as a result of the cost of living crisis. Again, 7 in 10 single parents have seen a decline in their mental health. 4 in 5 families with a baby have seen a decline in their mental health. And that's perhaps one of the most shocking statistics that there is, in frankly a bag of shocking statistics, is that a third of families with a baby live in poverty. So basically having a baby is a poverty risk, and that's obviously driven principally by people's gender. That will be women unable to secure decent incomes during the early years of their child's life. And it's very then difficult to kind of dig a family out of that hole. And for me, that's something we've had various governments of all colours really talk about wanting to make Scotland the best place in the world to grow up. But if a third of children and families with a baby are living in poverty, having to make the choices I've been talking about, well, then that simply cannot be the case. I think one of the things which I should have mentioned is one of those structural weaknesses that we have is the kind of gross extent of income and wealth inequality that exists in Scotland and the UK. Basically, the UK kind of pootled around international averages and kind of income and wealth disparity until the 1980s, and at which point they shot up to the point where, particularly on income, the UK is one of the least equal countries in the so-called developed world. And that just hasn't really come down, even during the kind of new Labour years of the turn of millennium, while there were some cash transfers into the hands of low-income families. We still have an enormous gap between the wealthiest in our community and the least well-off. And that, as I say, has been kind of feeding these issues that we see just now. I thought it'd be worth just highlighting who is most at risk of poverty. One of the biggest risks, and I will come back to this, but one of the biggest risks is a household where nobody's in work. About 54% of such households will live in relative poverty, whereas only 10% of families where somebody is able to work full-time would live in poverty. But that number keeps creeping up. For families with children, those most at risk are, as I mentioned already, single parents, but also families where somebody's disabled, that's whether an adult or a child, as well as minority ethnic families where they face poverty rates double that of white families. And I think there are particular issues in Glasgow that it's also worth reflecting. Glasgow has the highest child poverty rate in Scotland. It's about 30%, above the average of about 24%. But for example, for the Muslim population in Scotland, 63% of Muslim adults live in relative poverty. That's the highest rate of any individual group by quite some way. And as I mentioned at the start, we have seen enormous spikes in the last 20 years or so in levels of very deep poverty. And lots of that is driven by a rise in that group of people who are, as I say, either single adults, and some of that will be related to housing costs, which we'll come on to, but also in the way that the social security system has kind of withered away for those groups. But also, again, quite callously and not by mistake, I think through choice, for disabled people. The level of social security support for disabled people has gone down significantly. The system has become significantly more cruel, and it is putting an enormous burden on families. And the level of disability within our society is constantly going up as we age as a population. And I do think it's something, it really is a bit, I think, a shocking indictment on government policy for decades that we have allowed this to happen. So what are the principal causes of poverty? And some of this I've alluded to already. One is that there, to a large extent, and perhaps more acutely than has been for quite some time, is that work is not a consistent defense from poverty. It's often said that the best cure for poverty is a good job. Now, for most people, the ability to secure a good job will be a sufficient protection from poverty, but it's less and less the case. While, for example, in Scotland, the rate of people being paid the real living wage is much higher than elsewhere in the UK. And over, I think, I can't remember the exact figure, it was about 92% of people get paid over the real living wage. But the reliability of hours which people get, the reliability of their contracts, again, what happens if people get sick, if people have kids, if people become disabled, we live in very fragile times for those at the bottom end of the labour market. So we know we have at the moment employment rates which are as high as they've ever been, unemployment rates which are as low as they've ever been. And that's all while we're in a period of, if not technical, but very close to recession. Now, obviously there has been a tightening of the labour market for other reasons, but you know, in theory, this should mean that people's wages are being driven up and that poverty would go down, and we're just not seeing that happen. I mean, there are also other elements within it. Scotland has high levels of economic inactivity, certainly compared to the average in England and Wales. Northern Ireland has even higher rates. Some of that is a very poor overall public health, and Glasgow is and this is the wrong way of putting it, but is really the kind of shining example across the world of disparities in public health between our least and most well-off site. I mean, I think it's about 26 years of difference in healthy life expectancy between our wealthiest and poorest communities. I think it's a man now in Glasgow from a low-income postcode can expect to live 46 years of healthy life. I mean, it's crazy in a country as wealthy as ours. So there's that element, but there are also structural elements which have been there for a long time. I've already talked about disability and how difficult it is for people with disability to enter the labour market. I think for women as well, the cost of childcare, particularly for low-paid work, can mean that women are basically stuck between a rock and a rock. You can survive on pitiful levels of social security support, or you can get often low-paid, insecure jobs, but all of your income that you get from that goes on childcare. Now, obviously, different individuals make different decisions on what's best for them, but it's an invidious choice where there is no kind of win for women at the moment. And you see that shown in poverty statistics. Families with younger children tend to be in poverty, are far more likely to be in poverty, and that would be driven by women's inability to access the labour market, partly through basically it being an economically disadvantageous workplace causes a lot of issues. The value of social security is the next. The UK has the lowest by quite some way unemployment protection pretty much in the developed world. If you lose your job, the income replacement rate in the UK is somewhere between 20 and 30%. And if you have costs, you're basically stuffed. And we've shown recently in a report we've done with the Trussell Trust, because they are at the coalface, they know why people turn up at food banks, is that the basic standard allowance of universal credit is £85 for single people, even just to get the most basic household essentials costs £120. So just I think it's something which most people don't appreciate, in that the basic rates of universal credit in particular bear no resemblance whatsoever to what things cost. They are basically random numbers, and those random numbers don't add up to being able to keep the lights on or put food on the table. And for a couple, it's even worse. The standard allowance is £134 a week, and the basic essential shop will cost £200. So people who are having to rely on universal credit, which lots of people do, it's about 400,000 people in Scotland at any one time, and people bounce in and out of it as well. It's not a homogenous group of people. But if you are unfortunate enough to have to rely on a universal credit system, you are in trouble. And it's also part of the reason why work more and more isn't a reliable route out poverty for people, because prior to universal credit reforms, you would have been able to keep some of your social security income to a higher level as you worked. And that basically we have seen over the last 10 years or so, the level of wages have risen a bit, but as social security is withered away, people's incomes have become lower, hence enormous rises in in-work poverty. Next is housing costs, where Scotland's story is actually a bit better than elsewhere in the UK. Scotland has a comparatively more affordable housing system. Part of that is through focus of the Scottish Government in building more social homes in a way that basically social home building is largely stopped in England, where it has continued in Scotland. This has benefited low-income families in particular, who don't end up in the less secure and more kind of fractious cost environment for the private rented sector. Now, the private rented sector has grown in Scotland, it's grown in Glasgow. There are particular issues around areas with pressures from student housing as well. I mean, Edinburgh, Glasgow, bits of Fife, Aberdeen see particular pressures around the cost of the private rented sector. And what we see within the private rented sector are much higher rates of so-called after housing cost only poverty. So people who have modest but reasonable incomes who are forced into poverty because their rent means that they don't then, having paid the rent, don't have enough to cover other essentials. So I think in Scotland, as I say, we have a slightly better story to tell here, but it's fragile. You know, housing doesn't get built overnight, and the minute you stop building homes, the market kicks in and it becomes less and less affordable. Just the last two things I would say on the kind of causes of poverty is, one is access to services and just how difficult it can be if you're in low income yourself, and particularly in low income communities. Public services tend to be worse in low income communities than they are in high income communities. That's the wrong way around. It's more difficult to access services if you're in these areas. You're less likely to have a decent GP service. You're less likely to be closer to other NHS services. Social work services are now spread very thin by austerity, but also the complexity of the system. You know, if you were to lose your job, you will have to think about, right, I'm going to have to apply to universal credit. I'm going to go through a massive means test for that. I might get some help with my council tax, so I'll have to go to the council for help with that. I'll need to speak to my landlord. I need to speak to all the people who pay my bills, etc., etc. And you face a system which treats you with enormous stigma. And that's something I'm just going to come on to as one of the other drivers of poverty. Is, as I say, there's that issue of access to services where poorer areas get poorer service, which, as I say, is the wrong way around, but also a massively stigmatizing system. The so-called welfare reform over the last 10 years has, I say this in a non-public sphere, but has basically treated people who are struggling to get by as criminals, as guilty until proven innocent. The way that people are treated by the Department for Work and Pensions in particular is completely stigmatizing in a way that I think most people would find horrendous with themselves. And I do think that that's something which we need to reflect upon as a society. I mean, the way that people are tested and assessed for things like personal independence payments for disability support is really quite shocking. The way that job centres chase and bully people to seek work while on universal credit is, again, demeaning rather than encouraging. And we hear stories all the time of people having their benefits reduced, single parents who had to miss appointments at the job centre because their kid was sick, or because a school phones and said, you need to come and pick up your kid. Don't turn up the job centre, and suddenly universal credit goes down the next week from its already low level. And I do think that this is something I was having a look at some of the funds which you guys run. This is certainly something that we've looked at in our own systems over the last few years. But you know, there are references, for example, to deserving widows getting support, and I do think that this is a kind of language which certainly people who, how can I put this gently, but some politicians at least want to create this idea of a deserving versus an undeserving poor. And this, again, I think has very unhealthily wormed its way into the delivery of public services. And I think we should always push back against that kind of consideration. I think the other thing, and the Rowntree family did this back in the day, they're Quakers and were very snooty about alcohol consumption. But again, there's references to people who are alcohol and drug dependent. As I say, the explosion of mental ill health caused by low income will inevitably cause alcohol and drug dependency. They are symptoms of poverty, not causes. So I think it's other things like these where public services treat people poorly if they have addiction issues or have complex personal needs. And I think if we think as a society kind of ignoring that or trying to kind of, you know, give people a bit of a slap around the face and they'll sort themselves out, we've tried that for a long time and it's not working. And I think other things around things like cash first approaches rather than voucher approaches are, again, you know, I've heard this in other settings as well. What if we give I don't know, cash to people? Well, they could just spend it on food, but we're giving it to them to buy a washing machine. If people need money to buy food, they need money to buy food. I mean, it's not a, you know, you can survive for a while without a washing machine. You can't survive for very long without food. So that's, as I said, sorry, I did say I wasn't going to be that cheery. In terms of kind of what works, I think more and more we see in public services and in the third sector, and the third sector are much better at doing this, I should say, than any other sector. Basically, anti-poverty policy and services work best when they are designed with people who are experiencing poverty. You know, we've seen systems, for example, the Scottish Government's reform to disability assistance and social security has been designed with people with disabilities, with experience of using the DWP system, and it's a better system as a result. Yeah. Also, understanding carefully who policies are for, being able to target particular support at particular types of families, I think is really important. And like things like pensioner poverty dropped significantly over the early part of the millennium. That's because there were significant reforms to the state pension. The Conservative government, since the financial crash, brought in things like a triple lock on pensions, which ensures that people do not fall into poverty. Government decisions on this make huge impacts, and I think that's important to reflect on. And there's the kind of what doesn't work, and we've seen a bit of this in the debate in Scotland over the last wee while, particularly with the SNP leadership debate around. And this is definitely happening at a UK level of, well, what we need is economic growth. If we have economic growth, we will solve poverty. Now, don't get me wrong, I would happily argue that Scotland needs a more dynamic economy, an economy that, if it grows, it obviously puts more money into public services, people pay more taxes, etc., etc. It's a happier country. It's a country where people can have a better quality of life. But you should never be fooled that economic growth automatically reduces poverty. It doesn't. The economy grew in Scotland in the 1980s. Inequality and poverty went through the roof. Government choices as to how that money is distributed amongst society are enormously important. And so I do think it's worth it. It's one of my personal bugbears at the moment. I think, and so the last thing that Laura and I discussed briefly is that obviously the charitable funds which you administer and which pay out, I don't doubt for a second that the support that's provided through those will be of benefit to the individuals who receive it. But I also, when I was chatting to Laura, I kind of wonder as well, is obviously the organisations you come from, the Trades Hall as a whole, you obviously play an important role in the economy of Glasgow, and how your businesses operate, how your businesses think about how employees, how they bring their lives into their employment. What are policies which are within business, which are flexible to allow more people to work with, more women to work within businesses, more disabled people to work within businesses? How do you consider childcare? How do you consider transport costs within businesses? How do you consider progression within businesses? Again, we see lots of people with low income stuck on low incomes. And while there's lots of, I think, healthy focus on young people, because we know that young people can fall behind if they don't get the opportunities that they deserve when they're younger. But how do we look at supporting people who have been locked out of the labour market for a very long time? And I think that's where there's almost, I'm sure, as much kind of power and potential in what your organisations do out with their charitable purposes than there is within them. So I am getting bored of the sound of my own voice. So I'm going to stop now. And if anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to take them.
Can I ask you? My understanding, and it may be faulty, is that anybody accessing the Trussell Trust food banks has to be referred by some agency. Do you have a feel for what the unacknowledged group of people who don't have that access is? Because that must be an increasing number of people as well. Whether it's due to trying to avoid the stigma of poverty and having to go to the food bank, or whether it's people who are teetering on the brink and therefore are falling into the area where they should be using or potentially could be using the food bank. Do you have a feel for that?
To an extent, I mean, it's quite difficult to identify a group of people who don't come forward for these kind of things. But as I was saying, and the study we did at the end of last year related to the cost of living crisis, we did see, I think it was about 30% of low-income families had at some stage cut back on a meal, where I think it was only about 9% who had said that they tried to access a food bank. So, I mean, and the Trussell Trust would say that as well, as they would say, oh, if our numbers fall slightly, don't take it as read that demand has gone down, because some of that could be, well, people are getting stuck in the system and can't be referred through their partners, because you're right, you do have to be referred into Trussell Trust services. So yeah, the fact people who access food banks is not a reliable metric of whether or not people. It was a really great, BBC did a collection of short films recently, which was called, they were called Skint. It was a really good one with Peter Mullen in it. I encourage you to watch. And it really, so he's a single older gentleman, the character he plays, and it's about he's living in a high rise somewhere in Glasgow, and it's about there's a kind of food bank, a sort of pantry beside the lift, and it's all about him really fancying this wee packet of curry sauce that's sitting in this thing, and just how his pride won't let him go and take it. And I think that untapped demand that is there, I think is well worth keeping in mind. Yeah, again, it comes back to how you design services and support for people in a way which tries to reduce that stigma.
That's exactly what we were talking about in Lorraine. Lorraine, can you tell that story?
I'm obviously the social worker for the Trades House, so I do lots of visits to a very diverse ages of people. And we find in the high-rise, well, I find in the high-rise flats, especially in Glasgow, we have lots and lots of food that is wasted. And that's because they are at the base of where people stay. And there's also cameras, etc. And I had a very interesting conversation with the concierge who said 90% of it goes to waste because people will not use it because neighbours see them or it's within their area. So there is obviously a need for it, but it's just strategically put in the wrong place.
Yeah, again, I think that comes back to, as I say, services to try and help people are designed by the people who the demand is there for. They will be able to tell you that sort of stuff. There's some really good examples of it. It's a grouping in Dundee called Dundee Fighting for Fairness, who worked really carefully with Dundee City Council to help design some of their winter fuel help stuff. And take up there has been so much higher because people living in poverty there were able to say, look, you can't just have this as an online system. I could tell you the community centres, the football teams, the churches, where if you advertise this, you'll catch the people that you're looking for. And I think that real kind of local knowledge and connection to what people need is really important.
You formerly worked in policy and welfare development for the Scottish Government. And you moved to Russ Aid, to the Rowntree Trust. While you were working with the Scottish Government, did you feel that you were able to enhance the welfare and life of people, and that's why you moved, because you weren't able to do so, because you talked about structural difficulties, and I think that structural difficulty is very often government, whether it be Westminster or Holyrood, or was it because that you felt that the role of policy and welfare was not being met by the Scottish Government at the time?
Interesting question. I think probably more...
Well, from the people who were responsible for a lot of the analysis that you've given us this evening, and I would like to see how you think you could have improved the outcome while you were there, but you couldn't, so you've moved to the Rowntree Trust, where you're hoping to improve the outcome there. And by the way, I've never voted Tory in my life, before you think about it.
Well, as Barbara, who I know very well, will understand, is I don't much like being told what to do. And as a civil servant, you have to operate within the constraints of your political masters and the dark arts of the iron grip of the senior civil service. So I think we have, and it is interesting, like the politicians I worked with were a much more diverse group than the senior civil servants that I worked with. In that they're far...
That shouldn't surprise us, Chris. That shouldn't surprise. There's been analysis in Samson in the 1960s which says that senior civil servants, senior judges, senior whatever have roughly the same background. So that doesn't surprise us. It's how you interacted in terms of producing policy that I'm fascinated to hear about.
Yeah, I do think so. I think you have a couple of things. Is that the civil service is very disconnected from the communities that it's supposed to serve. It's very difficult to do that sort of much more interactive policy development, and I was as guilty of that in civil service as anybody else. There's also the politics of even a party or ministers who talked quite progressively about these kind of things. We're still stuck slightly in a sort of civic and public debate where we kind of tinker around the edges of some of these big issues which have been with us for a long time. And I do think, like, so from my personal perspective, my frustration was I was working within the constraints of, I thought, a debate where we were kind of ignoring the real issues that were there. And so from my perspective, being out in JRF with an ability to kind of speak my mind and explore some of these issues and actually go straight to the public and do much more understanding of not what politicians define as being as important, but what the public define as being important. And I feel like I can achieve more doing that in a role like this than I could within government. And I don't think that's a good thing.
I was going to ask you, I was really immensely surprised to hear that you said that about 63% of the Muslim community were in dire straits. And I'm really surprised to hear that. I assume that's in Scotland, but is that due to large families, or one must know surely the real reason for that?
It's a mix of different things. Apologies, I can't see you on the camera here, but I think there's Muslim workers in Scotland. It's the same across the UK, and actually the issues are actually far more acute in parts of England as well. But will tend to work in sectors with lower income, tends to work in things like transport, retail, etc., where incomes are lower. There's a far lower participation rate amongst women within the labour market as well. So households will tend to have single income households, which again, as I said, will increase your likelihood of being in poverty. But we're just about to publish a report on the labour market in Glasgow amongst minority ethnic communities, and we should not shy away from the fact that people face enormous discrimination, both from the colour of their skin and from their religion. It's more difficult for people from a Muslim background to get promoted. They're far more likely to have low-paid jobs below their skill and qualification level. So it's a mix of different things, but the rate amongst our Muslim community is absolutely outrageous, and obviously it's largely concentrated in Glasgow.
Sorry, Chris, my name is Shabir Beg, and I'm a Muslim, born and bred and governed in Glasgow. And at the moment, I've got great experience over the last 2-3 years on the impoverishment of Glasgow as a whole because of the lockdown. I got stuck in Glasgow, but I couldn't go through to Edinburgh. Now, we've got great engagements with the Scottish Government that's been growing for the last 3-4 years through community cohesion, faith and belief. So the Scottish Government is trying its best to show its diversity and inclusion. But this particular meeting is about the poverty per se for the whole country. And I'm quite intrigued by the question that Richard has given to you and the answer you've given. There's actually, see right just now, people are starving because they can't get halal food. They're literally starving, and Bruce is aware of this because he's assisted us in delivering halal chickens for the last, we've been doing it for the last 2 or 3 years since COVID started, and that's where I'm going now. I'll be leaving in 5 minutes. It's an iftar party, and we gave them chickens last week to do an iftar party today. So it's not one-sided. Everybody's trying their best. The food banks, the pantries, the Scottish Government, faith groups, the churches, they're not getting credit here maybe in Scotland. What the churches are doing, they're opening up the churches for Muslims to go and get fed, so on and so forth. So it's work to be done, and I would hope that the Trades House plays its part, which it has, and it always has done. And we are who we are as an organisation because of the Trades House, which I keep shouting about, but nobody's listening to me. Getting into the system.
So I see Duncan's got his hand up in Zoom here as well.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, fascinating presentation. Thank you very much indeed for sharing what is, as you rightly said, are some pretty gloomy statistics. So my first question is, do you have a general type of report or something that you could direct Trades House to with some of these statistics for general background reading and knowledge? Because I think if you had, that would be quite a helpful document. For my sins, I was Laura's predecessor as the chair of the Charities Committee, so very close to some of the funding that we have done and seen it firsthand, some of the poverty. But my second point, you talked about, the demand for the economy to grow more, and we've seen and heard that obviously in recent SNP leadership debates. And whilst I agree with you that growth per se is not the solution to everything, I think properly managed growth I think properly managed growth is essential to create the tax base to allow more money to go back into public services. The third point, in my background, I have done a lot of work for some very big care charities. And one of the issues which in Scotland we suffer from hugely, and I'd be interested to get your comments on it, was when Alex Salmond's government removed the ring fencing on disability funding through local councils as part of his deal with COSLA to fix council tax without increases. One of what we saw in the care sector, disability care sector, was the immediate impact on people who are supporting disability, whether for themselves or, as you pointed out, with the families that have disability involved with them. I mean, that to my mind is just inhumane, the way that decision was taken and the impact on people who really are struggling to be able to do things to help themselves. So interesting your comment on that. And the final thing, just to talk about, I came across a guy recently called Gary Stevenson, who was a top Citibank or Citibank Group trader, who is a multimillionaire and was at a very, very young age, in his 20s, a multimillionaire, and realised that the wealth gap was getting significantly worse in this country, and now campaigns for address that. And I mention that because if you go onto YouTube and look at some of his videos, they are absolutely horrific about what is happening with wealth versus poverty. And he was a man who came from very, very humble backgrounds in the East End of London, just happened to have a very good maths brain. But I'd be particularly interested on your comment on the disability issue that I raised.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll send to Laura a couple of links to our reports and stuff, and she can hopefully share around. I mean, I think your point on disability is very well made. I mean, I think social, like I talked quite a lot in my presentation around childcare and the issues that creates both for individuals and within the economy. I think the issues for social care and support for people with disabilities are equally acute, and we should see them as, like, because there's quite often lots of kind of quite fluffy, frankly, talk about well-being economy at the moment, and people talk almost as if the care sector is a separate thing which isn't part of the economy. It has to be. We have to see it as part of it, and we've really seen, and I think some of the way the outcomes agreements have changed with local government has had this, is that there's been an enormous stripping away of support for people with disabilities. We see it for additional support needs within schools, right up through adulthood. And I do think, as I say, the way that disabled people have been left behind by public policy, as we have frankly taken on, hopefully, a less stigmatizing approach, more understanding, a more open understanding of what disability means, the policy just hasn't caught up with it. So yeah, it is very worrying.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ryan.
Yes, we know poverty comes in all shapes and sizes. I read an article, a piece of research by a politician a number of years ago, who said in his report that we know that all poverty is damaging, but he felt the most damaging poverty of all was the poverty of ambition and expectation. What's your thoughts on that?
I think Darren McGarvey is very interesting in this. He was asked to do one of the Wreath lectures by the BBC this year. It's well worth listening to because it's on a similar subject. Is that, and he would say that both the left and the right of politics has let people down in this regard. So he would say that the right of politics has said, well, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you'll be fine. But at the same time, kind of left of politics has said, well, the state will sort all of this out. And that both of those views are kind of extreme and unrepresentative of actually people's experiences. And I do think where, as I say, I can get a bit frustrated with the, oh, don't worry, we'll have economic growth and that will sort things out chat. But I also think we shouldn't dismiss that. Because when I talk about what does curing poverty mean? It means that people should be able to explore their potential, to have choices in life, to be able to do things, to try things, to fail, to succeed in the ways that, frankly, people with higher incomes can. And I think we have a situation that I see it quite often when we are doing work with people with experience of poverty, that because we sometimes talk about people being in the grip of poverty, because people are having to make day-to-day decisions on how they keep the lights on, how they keep their kids' shoes wearable, that it does lead to a paucity of ambition, of drive. And frankly, why wouldn't it? Because we all know that if you're incredibly stressed, if you're incredibly anxious, you don't make the best decisions. You don't take risks. You just stumble by from day to day. So I do think I am not a firm believer that the state has to come in and design everything for everybody. I don't think most people want that. But we do also, I think we need to be mindful of the conditions which people are forced to live in, that we do need to improve that to allow that aspiration and that ambition to come back. It won't just happen by kind of hectoring people, which frankly is sometimes the approach of the DWP in particular.
Okay.
One more here.
Yeah, just a very quick question. Chris, I just wonder, do you have a view on whether there is any role for a citizen's basic income? I know there are challenges around how you would actually fund that. There have been some pilots, I think, in Finland and in Scotland. I just wondered if, as an organisation, you had a view or were doing any research into that, the impact that could have.
It's a good question. So JRF used to have quite a strong institutional view against a citizen's basic income, principally from the matter of cost. Because I think that's so Reform Scotland, for example, did a thing where they suggested a citizen's basic income of £6,500 that would replace the current benefit system. That would have cast hundreds of thousands of people into extreme poverty. As I've said, the adequacy of the social security system at present is very weak, but most people get a lot more than £6,500. Nobody can survive on £6,500. So to have a UBI which is sufficient would be extremely, I mean, I think it's about, it's almost like Scottish GDP every year to pay for it. But where I think when we work with people with lived experience of poverty, they are very keen on this idea, both from us. So there's a few things in it. One is adequacy of income. Two is stability. So at the moment, one of the issues with the universal credit system is in some ways it's a good bit of design in that it goes up and down depending on how people's income goes up and down. So if your income goes up one month, your universal credit will fall, and vice versa. Now that's clever in one way from a kind of keeps the bill down, but it also encourages people, if you want to take on more hours, you don't lose out. But it means it's very hard to predict what your income's going to be from month to month. And then finally, it's the stigma point. It's that you do not have to go through the song and dance of applying, of having a work coach bothering you every other week for stuff, and that it treats every person the same way. So it treats, you know, carers who spend all their time looking after someone in the same way as it does somebody else. It puts value into so-called unpaid care, you know, particularly bringing up children or caring for people in the home in a way which we just don't now. And so I think from my perspective, where I got JRF to kind of soften our line is we should not underestimate the positive impacts there would be in destigmatizing the current social security system, but also in recognizing the enormous contribution that, and it is frankly more often than not, women play in our economy just now in a way which is provided essentially for free, in a way that's really unfair. One of the craziest statistics I saw recently, there was that 70% of income tax is paid by men. Now, not only is that completely economically unsustainable, but it just shows you it's not just the gender pay gap in terms of hourly pay, but it's how women are being excluded, A, from higher paid roles, but also the work that they are doing within the economy is completely undervalued. And that's where I think things like a UBI or CBI can potentially be transformational. I don't think it's going to happen though.
Any more questions? Well, Chris, thanks. That was brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to let you go and hang on to everybody else just for 5 minutes or so before we finish up. But can I just ask everyone to thank Chris?
Thank you very much. See you later.
Let me get back to domesticity.
Thanks. Bye.
I don't want to keep you. We've got the room till 7:30. No need to rush. However, can you all go back to your master courts and, if you can, have a chat of what we've heard and feedback into us to see if we should be doing things differently or in addition in the Charities Committee. I'm happy to take emails from you. I'm sure that, you know, Bruce will do the same with the chain gang. Just try and think out the box a wee bit about what we're doing, what we're doing with our money. Can we do bigger things? Duncan, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just a quick suggestion, Laura. The Charities criteria paper that was developed, about 7 years ago now, Chris made one or two, I thought, quite provocative comments about, you know, around well-deserving people receiving money. And I haven't looked at the document just now, but it struck me that maybe that document, in light of what we've heard tonight, would benefit from maybe a revamp. Now, there's the obvious challenge that some of the trusts that we disperse money from we can't alter the terms of them, but we can maybe push the boundaries of that to reflect some of what Chris said this evening.
And one of the things we discussed at the Charity Committee meeting was that sometimes we feel we're not actually reaching those that we should be. You know, one of the Lodging House mission, for example, we felt that it was perhaps getting more at the core of those in abject poverty and no housing. Similarly, ex-offenders we didn't really look at. There was a lot of areas which in the past we would get referrals from which are not meeting. And Lorraine, what were the few that you suggested that we're not getting referrals from now?
Because there's not drop-in centres like lunch clubs. People are not seeing their GP. There's no indication from GPs to refer them on to somewhere. It's a phone call, so they're not physically being seen. And on a phone, given I've done 2 years of assessing people on the phone, that is the most difficult job you're ever likely to do, because you don't see somebody, you don't see the difference, you don't notice anything, and where people aren't seen, they fall away. And I think that's the bit that's the scary bit, is There is very few places out there now seeing people who will notice a difference or who will be able to pass on concerns to anybody. And again, there's no child, like baby massage, things where health visitors, district nurses used to run things to help people. They're just not restarted since COVID. So there's a right, people who know the system will always know how to get them help, but people who don't know the system, who have lost a job, who've never used the system, there is no pointers to how to do it.
Isn't there an argument in the Trades House contacting various groupings who deal with focus in the city, for example, General Medical Council's variation, there must be a BMA kind of rep who could circulate kind of knowledge to that the Trades House is there. Because of a variety of reasons we're not getting the referrals, we may be able to help. I mean, there must be groups we can feed into and say, look, we are here.
We have done that, we've done drop-in, but the problem is there's nobody going to these places to, you know, like, there's nobody to gather the information. There's a GP's not seeing, so 15 minutes on the phone, what's wrong? Oh, I've twisted my wrist. Right, that's fine, they sort it, whereas if they would normally have seen somebody coming in hobbling or looking very anemic or whatever, they would maybe, or very unkempt, they would have picked up on that. Because there's no visual, there's very limited visual for a lot of people now, and people have chosen not to because they're frightened. They don't want to end up in the hospital because it's doom and gloom that they're going to get put in hospital, they're not going to get a service, they're going to lie in a hospital bed, so they don't go to the hospital. So there's lots of fear in a lot of age groups where they're not seen. I think that's the scary bit, is people are not seen.
And the other bit is, of course, the BMA bits, as you're suggesting, it's collapsed 10 years ago.
Yeah. So fun enough, I'm married to a GP who sees folk, fun enough, which is quite an interesting concept, isn't it? Because I think nobody's seeing GPs. She's also a palliative care specialist, so she's in homes with people who are seriously at the end of life stuff. So there must be ways or groups that we can communicate with and say, look, we understand life's out there hard. We may not be able to do much, but come to us with your problems, and they're not just financial problems, but I mean, Chris talked about structural problems. I think the biggest structural problem we have, he was saying that civil servants are disconnected, government is disconnected. I mean, he was influencing and writing policy documents and we're in a shambles. So I think we may have to be more proactive as a charity and find ways of finding the very people you're speaking about. We need to find ways of communicating with people, and it may be through organisations that exist. It may be, I don't know, let's say the Archdiocese, and what you're doing in terms of.
But it's stop being top down. Basically,
I'm not suggesting being top down, I'm suggesting making contact. There's a big difference.
Yes,
there's a big difference
where people are congregating.
Yes.
And it's important, it's all very well getting in touch with the GP organisational structure, but how are they going to send the information out? Emails, how many emails do the GPs and the nurses get, which never get opened? So, you know, these are not good ways of doing it. So I think you're right, we've got to go.
What is the problem? And is the problem the way we communicate, or I think it's a failure to communicate? Yes, our structure.
Yes,
and so we need to find a way where we can say to folk, this is a resource in this city which has not been made useful for a variety of reasons, and it could be our structure. We just have failed.
It has been useful.
It has been useful when we're giving away 450,000 quid a year. It's been useful.
Perhaps we need to be giving it to the level below what we are. And it's finding people, and I'll speak to my daughter because she deals with that sort of thing.
And I think we must have a lot of experience and a lot of contacts within all our different master boards. And it's trying to, and I'm not suggesting that would trump, you know, the kind of Charities Committee would trump what the crafts would do. But there must be a great wealth of ideas and contacts and whatever that we could use and come together and shape something for the next 10 years.
I think you're right, Laura, because the coroner's a number of years ago gave out trainers to young people. What do you call it?
Body and soul.
Yeah, so, no, seriously, I mean, the Skinners made contact with the East End of the city and did gloves and scarves and hats for the folk who are using Logic House Mission and whatever. I mean, there is work there. We just need to build on that work at that level. But we need to make sure that people know we can do that.
But you're right about the structure. We have the structure from Body and Soul to give these trainers and footwear generally, etc., in a council bank, which is then given out to the kids who need to use it. And so there's a structure there for that. And what I'm kind of picking up is we don't have that across the board in Trades House for people to be able to benefit from what we've got in a way that's organised. And so therefore people are missing out. And that to me would actually seem like one of the easier things to sort, rather than, you know, trying to sort basically world hunger that, you know, Chris has just been talking about.
Tom, the Body and Soul project, which Ian Lennart came up with, it's given out £83,000, but we didn't actually give it out. What we did was we said to coordinators of physical activity in Glasgow, who then contacted individual schools, and then that came back from them into the coordinator, and then the coordinator said to the coordinators, here are bids from X amount of schools. So we didn't hand the money out to them. We asked them to tell us where the need is, what the need is, and how much you would need to do that.
I think that's the idea, Brian. I mean, there are people there at that level, which are making that. We need to make contact with them so that they can form a bridge between those in need and what we might be able to help with. And I think that's the big problem for us. We need to develop that.
Toyota model in business. You go to the people on the factory floor and ask them how to sort it, how to sort productivity. They know where the blockers are. The guy sitting on the top floor has no idea what the blockers are. So you go to the people that know and learn from them, and then put the structures in place to enable them to do things better.
And I think I think it has been a bit of a reactive service that we've given. There's a website, there's the application form, get on with it. So, you know, you can find a huge disparity of application forms. You think, why are we giving to this person to, you know, there's no reason not to, but in actual fact, there's a far more deserving person here that maybe hasn't applied. And I think it's trying to get our heads around how to do that properly, that's actually fit for purpose and also doesn't involve any stigma. I don't know how else that might have an impact. We talked a lot about stigma and you know, people not taking food that's in their, you know, on their doorstep because
it is, I mentioned that basically post-COVID, we're in a bit of a new world now. And so I think maybe it's a time for a refresh.
Yes.
And that's a good reason for a refresh, and maybe positive stuff will come out.
I was interested in the fact that he thought that deserving poor was a concept that had come into vogue recently. It's been going since the medieval period, because the Victorians were brilliant on deserving poor. Only those who were prepared to make an effort got the benefit of our largesse. I mean, so I find that quite interesting that this deserving poor thing. But he's right that there has been in a lot of charitable activity in Great Britain a huge concentration on deserving poor, as if somehow or other there's an undeserving poor.
You're not grateful enough. No. You don't look cute. Yeah. Elaine, hi, get your hand up.
Hi there, yeah. I wanted to say that I do admire the fact that you're trying to do things better, but don't forget to pat yourselves on the back as well on how well you do things already. One of the things that I liked very much about the Commonweal presentation was the number of different types of charities that benefit from the giving. And it's one thing to talk about food banks and that level of necessity, but actually what I saw from the Commonweal presentation is that we are enhancing people's lives in other ways as well, be that pens and pencils for school kids, or that's nice garden spaces or spaces for kids to play. So that was my first point. Don't forget how well you're already doing things. My second point was Tom mentioned the Skinner's glove drive. When I became deacon, I tried to piggyback off that, and I contacted Hugh and said, "You're doing gloves for the lodging house mission. How about the tailors do a jacket drive, and we'll gather jackets together, you do the gloves, we'll give it all over to the lodging house mission, and it's a joint effort." And Hugh was incredibly helpful, gave me all the details, and I contacted the lodging house mission and they said thanks but no thanks. Post-COVID, we can't guarantee the cleanliness. The only thing we'll really accept by the way of clothing is vouchers. And I can't give vouchers because my restricted funds, but I could gather jackets quite happily. So at that point, the window of opportunity was closed for me, and I'll do something different this year, or I'll give it to the Samaritans, or I'll give it to someone else. I'll find someone else. But when you're talking about going to the master course, you've got two major restrictions. The first is that we are rotating people, and a lot of people are coming on and they're spending 1 year concentrated, and that's where you do all the learning. And then you've got a couple of years afterwards. And the second is that structure that you're talking about of everybody helping each other, I think is very important. And I think we find out about that structure. You know, you don't find out about the chain gang and how helpful they can be until you're part of it. And until I went to the Weavers dinner, I didn't realize, oh, hang on a second, look how connected their stakeholders are to mine and how much I could benefit their companies at the same time as mine, and what that networking really felt like and what could mean. So the master course are very important, but I don't think they're as good a resource as the committee that you've got, which is more static. Doesn't mean that they're useless in any way, shape or form. It probably means that we need more help, more structure. But anyway, those were my points. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, and any input from, as I say, more than welcome. Thank you. I'm conscious of time. To be continued. We'll probably do another one of these in 6 months' time, and we can share all our experiences since then. So thanks very much for coming, and safe home, everybody. Very good. Thank you.